On September 15, 1944, the 1st Marine Division waded ashore onto the beaches of Peleliu, a tiny coral island in the Palau chain, 500 miles east of the Philippines. The Marines had been told the island would be secured in 4 days. The battle lasted 73 days. The Marines had been told casualties would be light. Nearly 10,000 Americans were killed or wounded. The Marines had been told the battle was necessary for the invasion of the Philippines. It wasn't. The Battle of Peleliu was one of the bloodiest and most controversial engagements in the Pacific War. It was fought with exceptional courage and resulted in a tactical American victory. But it was also, by most strategic assessments, completely unnecessary. The island could have been bypassed, the Japanese garrison left to wither, and thousands of American lives saved. This is the story of Peleliu, why it was fought, how it became a charnel house of death and suffering, and why military historians consider it one of the most tragic mistakes of World War II. It is a story of exceptional bravery wasted on an objective that didn't matter, of men who died taking an island that should have been left alone, and of the gap between strategic necessity and military pride. By September 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively in America's favor. The Japanese Navy had been crippled at Midway in June 1942 and further damaged in subsequent battles. American forces had pushed across the Central Pacific, taking the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. General Douglas MacArthur's forces had advanced up the northern coast of New Guinea. The next major objective was the Philippines. MacArthur had famously promised, "I shall return," when he evacuated the Philippines in 1942, and he was determined to fulfill that promise. The planned invasion, Operation King, was scheduled for October 1944, with American forces landing on Leyte in the central Philippines. The question facing American planners was, what needed to be done before the Philippines invasion? What Japanese positions needed to be neutralized? What bases needed to be captured to support the operation? Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Forces, believed that Peleliu and Angkor, 2 islands in the Palau chain, needed to be taken before the Philippines invasion. His reasoning was that these islands had airfields from which Japanese aircraft could threaten MacArthur's right flank during the Leyte operation. Additionally, capturing the Palaus would provide anchorage for the Pacific Fleet and airfields to support subsequent operations. The operation was designated Stalemate Tantuao, and the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General William Rupertus, was assigned to take Peleliu. The Army's 81st Infantry Division would take Angkor, a smaller island to the south. But there was a problem with this strategic analysis. It was based on outdated assumptions about Japanese capabilities and the nature of modern warfare. Peleliu is a coral island roughly 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, located approximately 500 miles east of Mindanao in the Philippines. Before the war, it had been a Japanese Mandate territory with a small civilian population engaged in fishing and phosphate mining. By 1944, the Japanese had turned it into a heavily fortified military base. The island's terrain was nightmarish. The southern portion was relatively flat and contained the airfield, the primary American objective. But the northern 2/3 of the island was dominated by a complex system of coral ridges, ravines, and peaks that the Marines would come to call the Umurbrogol, though it would be better known by its American designation, Bloody Nose Ridge. The coral ridges were honeycombed with natural and man-made caves. The Japanese had spent months fortifying these positions, creating an intricate network of caves, tunnels, and bunkers, connected by underground passages. Some caves could hold hundreds of men. The coral was so hard that American explosives barely affected it. The ridge system was virtually impregnable to conventional assault. But here's the critical point. By September 1944, Peleliu didn't matter strategically. American carrier-based aircraft had already neutralized the Japanese air forces in the palace during raids earlier in the month. The Third Fleet, under Admiral William Bull Halsey, had conducted strikes on September 6th-8th, destroying over 200 Japanese aircraft and demonstrating that Japanese air power in the region was negligible. Based on these results, Halsey sent a message to Nimitz recommending that the Palau operation be cancelled. He argued that the islands posed no real threat, and that the forces assigned to take them would be better used in the Philippines invasion itself. Nimitz received this recommendation and forwarded it to the Joint Chiefs of Staff with his endorsement. MacArthur also supported cancelling or postponing the Palau operation. But by this point, the wheels were already in motion. The invasion convoys were at sea. The troops were loaded on their ships, approaching the target. The naval bombardment had already begun. Cancelling the operation at this late stage would require complex and potentially dangerous maneuvers. Turning back the convoys, reorganizing the forces, and replanning their use. The decision was made to proceed with the operation. Peleliu would be invaded as planned. Thousands of Marines were about to be committed to taking an island that didn't need to be taken, for an objective that no longer existed. The Japanese garrison on Peleliu numbered approximately 11,000 men, commanded by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. This was a far larger force than American intelligence had estimated. Initial estimates put Japanese strength at around 5,000 to 6,000 men. But numbers were not the most significant difference. What really mattered was that the Japanese had completely changed their defensive strategy. In earlier Pacific battles, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, the Japanese had concentrated their defenses on the beaches, attempting to destroy the American landing forces at the water's edge. When this failed, as it usually did, they would launch suicidal Banzai charges, throwing their forces against American positions in mass frontal attacks that resulted in the near-total destruction of the Japanese garrison within a few days. This strategy had consistently failed. American firepower, naval gunfire, artillery, tanks and infantry weapons made beach defenses untenable and turned Banzai charges into suicide. The Japanese needed a new approach. Colonel Nakagawa had studied previous battles and developed a radically different defensive concept. Rather than defending the beaches, he would allow the Americans to land relatively unopposed. Rather than wasting men in Banzai charges, he would husband his forces for a prolonged defense. He would use the natural cave systems in the Umurbrogol ridges to create a defense in depth that would bleed the Americans for every yard of ground. The strategy was simple but effective. Make the Americans pay such a high price for Peleliu that the cost of taking subsequent islands would become politically and militarily unacceptable. Even if Peleliu eventually fell, if the Japanese could inflict enough casualties, future American operations might be cancelled or modified. Nakagawa had his engineers prepare the defenses meticulously. Caves were expanded and improved. Artillery positions were carefully camouflaged. Fields of fire were precisely calculated. Storage areas for ammunition, food, and water were established in the caves. The ridge system was turned into a fortress that could withstand the heaviest American bombardment. Critically, Nakagawa ordered his men not to launch Banzai charges. They would fight from prepared positions, fall back when necessary, and use the terrain to their advantage. They would make every American advance as costly as possible. It was a defensive strategy years ahead of its time, and the Marines were about to encounter it for the first time. Before the landing, American forces subjected Peleliu to one of the heaviest pre-invasion bombardments of the Pacific War. For 3 days, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded the small island with thousands of tons of high-explosive shells. Carrier aircraft dropped bombs and napalm. The bombardment was so intense that Navy officers confidently predicted that nothing could have survived it. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the bombardment force, announced that the Navy had run out of targets. Everything worth shooting at had been destroyed. The island, he assured the Marines, had been neutralized. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. The problem was that the bombardment, while impressive in scale, was largely ineffective against Nakagawa's cave defenses. The caves were deep enough that naval shells couldn't penetrate them. The Japanese simply waited out the bombardment in their underground positions, emerging only after the shelling stopped. Additionally, the bombardment had focused on obvious targets, visible fortifications, the airfield, buildings. But Nakagawa's most important defensive positions were camouflaged and integrated into the natural terrain. They hadn't been detected, much less destroyed. The Marines, preparing to go ashore, heard the optimistic assessments from the Navy and expected a quick, relatively easy operation. They had been told to expect 4 days of fighting. Some Marines joked that they'd be back aboard ship in time for steak dinners. They were about to discover that Peleliu would be nothing like the previous battles they had studied. This would be something new, something worse. At 8:32 a.m. on September 15th, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches of Peleliu. The landing beaches were designated, from north to south, White Beach 1, White Beach 2, Orange Beach 1, Orange Beach 2, and Orange Beach 3. The landing initially went better than expected. Japanese resistance on the beaches was light, just sporadic mortar and artillery fire. The Marines pushed inland quickly, expecting heavier resistance at any moment. Then, as the Marines moved off the beaches and into the island's interior, the trap sprang shut. Japanese artillery and mortar fire, carefully pre-registered on the beaches and inland areas, began falling with devastating accuracy. The fire came from positions in the ridges that the naval bombardment had completely missed. Japanese observers in the caves could see the entire landing area and were directing fire onto the most lucrative targets. The Marines found themselves caught in a killing zone. Artillery shells crashed down on the beach. Mortar rounds exploded among the assault waves. Machine gun fire raked the advancing troops, and the source of much of this fire was invisible, hidden in caves and fortified positions that the Marines couldn't see, much less effectively engage. The 1st Marines, landing on the left flank, ran directly into a fortified position called the Point, a coral outcropping honeycombed with Japanese positions. The fighting for the Point would take days and cost hundreds of casualties. In the center, the 5th Marines pushed toward the airfield, the main objective of D-Day. They took the southern portion of the airfield by afternoon, but at significant cost. Every advance was opposed by Japanese defenders, firing from concealed positions. When Marines tried to engage these positions with direct fire, the Japanese would simply retreat deeper into their caves, wait for the Marines to move on, and then reappear to fire on them from behind. On the right flank, the 7th Marines encountered swamps and rough terrain that channeled their advance into kill zones covered by Japanese weapons. Casualties mounted rapidly. By nightfall of D-Day, the Marines had secured a beachhead and taken the southern portion of the Airfield. But casualties had been much higher than expected, roughly 200 killed and 900 wounded on the first day, and the Marines had barely penetrated the island's interior. The worst fighting was still ahead. Over the following days, the Marines pushed north toward the Umurbrogol ridges, the complex of coral peaks and valleys that dominated the northern portion of the island. They were about to encounter the most difficult terrain and the most determined resistance of the entire Pacific War. The ridges were a nightmare. The coral was sharp enough to shred uniforms, boots, and skin. The heat was unbearable. Temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the coral reflected and intensified the sun's rays. There was no shade, no relief. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Water supplies were constantly inadequate. The terrain made conventional tactics almost impossible. Tanks couldn't climb the ridges. Artillery had limited effect on caves. Air support was dangerous because American and Japanese positions were often only yards apart. The Marines had to fight their way up the ridges, clearing Japanese positions one by one in brutal close quarters combat. The Japanese defense was masterful. They had fortified every cave, every ridge, every approach. When the Marines advanced, the Japanese would fall back to the next position. When the Marines tried to bypass a position, the Japanese would emerge and attack from behind. The caves were interconnected by tunnels, allowing Japanese troops to move unseen and pop up where they were least expected. Flamethrowers became the most important weapon in the Marine arsenal. When Marines encountered a cave entrance, they would first try to get the Japanese to surrender. They rarely did. Then they would use demolitions to try to seal the cave. This often failed because of the interconnected tunnel system. Finally, they would use flamethrowers, sending streams of burning napalm deep into the caves. It was horrific work. The Marines who operated flamethrowers had perhaps the most dangerous job in the battle. They had to get close to Japanese positions while carrying tanks filled with highly flammable fuel. They were priority targets for Japanese snipers and often had very short life expectancies. The fighting for the ridges was measured in yards per day, sometimes yards per week. The 1st Marines, fighting on the left flank of the ridge system, were being decimated. By September 23rd, just 8 days into the battle, the regiment had suffered over 60% casualties. Of the approximately 3,000 men who had landed, more than 1,800 were dead or wounded. General Rupertus finally relieved the shattered 1st Marines, replacing them with the 321st Regimental Combat Team from the Army's 81st Infantry Division, which had already secured Anga and was available for commitment to Peleliu. General Rupertus had insisted from the beginning that the Marines could take Peleliu without Army help. It was a point of pride. The Marine Corps had built its reputation on amphibious assaults, and Rupertus didn't want to dilute the Marine achievement by bringing in Army units. This attitude cost lives. Rupertus kept his Marines in the line long after they should have been pulled out. Units that had suffered 50%, 60%, even 70% casualties were kept attacking. Men who were physically and mentally exhausted, who had been fighting in hellish conditions for weeks, were pushed forward again and again. The 1st Marines should have been relieved after the first week. Instead, they fought for 8 days before Rupertus finally accepted that they were no longer combat effective. By that point, the regiment had essentially been destroyed as a fighting force. When the Army's 81st Infantry Division was finally committed, the fresh troops made better progress than the exhausted Marines. This wasn't because the Army soldiers were better fighters. They weren't, and the Marines resented the implication, but simply because they were fresh, while the Marines had been ground down by nearly constant combat. The inter-service rivalry and institutional pride that characterized the Pacific War had real costs. Men died because commanders were unwilling to admit they needed help or that their plans had been wrong. While the American suffering at Peleliu was extreme, the Japanese defenders endured their own hell. They were cut off from resupply, had limited water, and were being slowly compressed into an ever smaller area of the island. Japanese soldiers lived in the caves, unable to move freely above ground during daylight because of American artillery and air attack. The heat in the sealed caves was worse than outside. The smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and decomposing corpses was overwhelming. Many Japanese soldiers developed dysentery and other diseases, but they continued fighting with extraordinary determination. They had been ordered to hold Peleliu and make the Americans pay for it, and they obeyed. Even as their situation became hopeless, even as they ran low on ammunition and supplies, they continued to resist. Colonel Nakagawa moved his headquarters several times as American forces closed in. He maintained radio contact with Japanese headquarters, sending regular reports on the battle's progress. His messages reveal a commander who knew the battle was lost, but was determined to fulfill his mission of inflicting maximum casualties on the Americans. Unlike previous battles where Japanese garrisons had been wiped out in days, the Peleliu garrison held out for over 2 months. They achieved Nakagawa's objective of making the Americans pay dearly for every yard of ground. By early October, the Marines had secured most of Peleliu except for the Umurbrogol pocket, the remaining Japanese-held area in the northern ridges. The Army's 81st Infantry Division had now taken over the primary responsibility for reducing this pocket. The fighting continued with undiminished intensity. The Army soldiers faced the same nightmarish conditions the Marines had encountered: brutal heat, razor-sharp coral, invisible enemies, and an enemy who fought from caves and refused to surrender. New tactics were developed. Engineers used bulldozers to attack the ridges, literally tearing down coral peaks to expose Japanese positions. Tanks were used as mobile pillboxes, providing direct fire support for infantry attacks. Artillery fire was closely coordinated with infantry advances, but progress remained slow and costly. The Japanese had months to prepare their defenses, and they had done the job well. Every cave had to be cleared individually. Every ridge had to be taken yard by yard. By late October, the original timetable, 4 days, had stretched to 6 weeks. The battle had become an embarrassment to the senior commanders who had planned it. Casualties continued to mount for an objective that everyone now recognized as strategically worthless. On November 24, 1944, 70 days after the initial landing, Colonel Nakagawa burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. His remaining troops, now numbering fewer than 100 men, continued to resist from the remaining caves. On November 27th, the Umurbrogol pocket was declared secure. The Battle of Peleliu was officially over, though small groups of Japanese soldiers continued to hide in the caves. The last verified Japanese holdout on Peleliu didn't surrender until April 1947, nearly 2.5 years after the battle ended. The final butcher's bill was staggering. The 1st Marine Division had suffered approximately 6,500 casualties, over 1,200 killed and 5,300 wounded. This represented roughly 40% of the division's strength. Some units had suffered far higher casualty rates. The 1st Marines had essentially ceased to exist as a coherent unit. The Army's 81st Infantry Division suffered approximately 3,300 casualties in taking Angkor and fighting on Peleliu. Combined American casualties exceeded 10,000 men. The Japanese garrison of approximately 11,000 men was virtually annihilated. Only about 200 Japanese soldiers survived to be taken prisoner, and most of these were laborers rather than combat troops. The rest had been killed in the fighting or had committed suicide. In terms of casualty rates, Peleliu was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The percentage of casualties exceeded that of Iwo Jima, though Iwo Jima's absolute numbers were higher. In the aftermath of the battle, it became clear that Admiral Halsey had been right. Peleliu didn't need to be taken. The airfield on Peleliu was never used to support the Philippines invasion. MacArthur's forces landed on Leyte on October 20th, 1944, more than a month after the Peleliu landing, and Japanese air attacks from the Palaus posed no significant threat to the operation. The feared attacks from Palau-based aircraft never materialized because the Japanese had already lost most of their air power in the region. The anchorage that Peleliu was supposed to provide for the Pacific Fleet was never used. The Navy had adequate bases elsewhere and had no need for Peleliu's limited facilities. The island did eventually serve as a base for Army aircraft, but these operations began long after the Philippines invasion and could easily have been conducted from other bases. In short, every strategic justification for taking Peleliu proved to be either incorrect or unnecessary. The island could have been bypassed, the garrison left to wither without supplies or support, and thousands of American lives saved. This assessment wasn't just made in hindsight. As noted earlier, Halsey had recommended canceling the operation before it began. MacArthur had supported that recommendation. The strategic conditions that supposedly made Peleliu necessary had changed before the first Marine went ashore. But the operation went forward anyway, primarily because of bureaucratic momentum, inter-service rivalry, and the difficulty of changing plans once they were in motion. Peleliu taught several important lessons, though these lessons came at terrible cost. The Japanese were adapting. The defense of Peleliu demonstrated that the Japanese had learned from their earlier defeats and were developing new tactics that made American victories far more costly. The strategy of defense in depth, using natural caves and avoiding wasteful Banzai charges, would be employed again at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, with even more devastating results. Intelligence failures have consequences. American intelligence had underestimated Japanese strength on Peleliu by nearly 50% and had failed to appreciate the extent of the cave defenses. Better intelligence might have led to different planning or different tactics. Terrain matters. The coral ridges of Peleliu created conditions that negated many American advantages. Tanks couldn't maneuver effectively. Artillery had limited impact on caves. Even overwhelming firepower couldn't quickly overcome defenders in such favorable terrain. Fresh troops matter. The decision to keep exhausted Marine units in combat, rather than rotating them out, cost lives and reduced effectiveness. Future operations would place more emphasis on unit rotation and maintaining the fighting capability of assault troops. Strategic flexibility is important. The inability or unwillingness to cancel Peleliu, even after the strategic situation had changed, demonstrated a dangerous inflexibility in American planning. The operation had momentum, and stopping it was deemed too difficult or embarrassing, so it went forward despite no longer serving a strategic purpose. Behind the statistics and strategic analyses were individual human beings who suffered and died on Peleliu. The Marines and soldiers who fought there endured some of the worst combat conditions of the entire war. Eugene Sledge, who fought on Peleliu with the 1st Marine Division and later wrote one of the most acclaimed memoirs of the Pacific War, With the Old Breed, described the battle as worse than anything he experienced on Okinawa. The heat, the terrain, the smell of decomposing bodies, the constant danger and the sheer brutality of the close quarters fighting created conditions that broke men physically and psychologically. Many veterans of Peleliu suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some never recovered from their experiences. The battle haunted them for the rest of their lives. The Japanese soldiers who died on Peleliu, fighting for an island that their high command knew would eventually fall, also deserve recognition. They followed orders, fought with determination, and died far from home for a cause that was already lost. The 1st Marine Division was so badly damaged at Peleliu that it had to be withdrawn from combat for months to rebuild. The division would not see combat again until the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. General Rupertus, whose optimistic predictions and refusal to accept army help had contributed to the high casualties, died of a heart attack in March 1945. Some attributed his death partly to the stress and guilt over Peleliu. For years, Peleliu was largely forgotten in the American public consciousness. Unlike Iwo Jima or Okinawa, which were extensively covered in the media and became symbols of American sacrifice in the Pacific, Peleliu received relatively little attention. This was partly because the battle lacked a dramatic, iconic image like the Iwo Jima flag raising, and partly because the strategic uselessness of the battle made it an embarrassment that military authorities preferred not to emphasize. Veterans of Peleliu felt this neglect keenly. They had fought one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, had suffered terribly, and had accomplished their mission, but few people seemed to remember or care. The battle was the forgotten battle of the Pacific War. This began to change in the 1980s and 1990s as historians reassessed the Pacific War and as memoirs like Eugene Sledge's brought Peleliu to wider attention. The 2010 HBO miniseries The Pacific, which featured Sledge's story, introduced the battle to a new generation. Today, Peleliu is recognized as one of the most significant and tragic battles of the Pacific War. Significant because of the tactical and operational lessons it taught. Tragic because it didn't need to be fought. The central question about Peleliu remains: why was the battle fought when senior commanders knew, or should have known, that it was unnecessary? Part of the answer lies in bureaucratic momentum. Once large military operations are planned and set in motion, changing or cancelling them becomes extremely difficult. Ships were loaded, troops were briefed, supplies were allocated, timetables were set. Undoing all of this at the last moment would have been complicated and potentially chaotic. Part of the answer lies in institutional pride and inter-service rivalry. The Marine Corps wanted to demonstrate its capability. The Navy wanted to support its own operations rather than simply supporting MacArthur's Army-dominated Southwest Pacific Command. These institutional interests sometimes took precedence over rational strategic calculation. Part of the answer lies in simple inertia and the difficulty of admitting that plans were wrong. Senior commanders had approved the Peleliu operation. Cancelling it would have been an admission of error, and military institutions are often reluctant to acknowledge mistakes, especially ones that might affect careers and reputations. But none of these explanations excuse the decision to proceed with an operation that was no longer strategically necessary. When Admiral Halsey recommended cancelling Peleliu, his recommendation should have been given more weight. When MacArthur supported that recommendation, it should have been taken seriously. Instead, over 10,000 Americans were killed or wounded taking an island that contributed nothing to winning the war. To put Peleliu in context, it's worth comparing it to other Pacific battles. Tarawa, November 1943. 3 days, 3,400 American casualties. Tarawa was shocking in its intensity, but mercifully brief. The island was small, the objective clear, and the battle ended quickly. Saipan, June-July 1944. 25 days, 13,000 American casualties. Saipan was larger than Peleliu, and the casualties were higher in absolute terms. But Saipan was strategically crucial. It provided bases for B-29 bombers to attack Japan, and its capture effectively ended Japanese control of the Central Pacific. Iwo Jima, February-March 1945. 36 days, 26,000 American casualties. Iwo Jima was even bloodier than Peleliu, but it served a clear strategic purpose, providing an emergency landing field for damaged B-29s and a base for fighter escorts. Historians estimate that the island saved the lives of thousands of American airmen. Okinawa, April-June 1945. 82 days, 49,000 American casualties. Okinawa was the largest and costliest battle of the Pacific War, but it was seen as necessary preparation for the invasion of Japan itself. Peleliu stands out in this list because, unlike the others, it served no clear strategic purpose. It was bloodier than Tarawa, lasted longer than Iwo Jima, in terms of organized resistance, and achieved nothing that couldn't have been achieved by simply bypassing the island. The Battle of Peleliu left several important legacies for American military doctrine and operations. Bypass strategy vindicated. The success of bypassing other Japanese strongholds, Rabaul, Truk, and numerous other islands, was confirmed by the futility of taking Peleliu. American strategy for the remainder of the war emphasized bypassing strongly held positions when possible. Importance of strategic flexibility. The inability to cancel Peleliu when strategic conditions changed led to increased emphasis on maintaining flexibility in operational planning. Military planners became more willing to adjust or cancel operations when circumstances changed. Recognition of Japanese tactical evolution. Peleliu demonstrated that Japanese defensive tactics had evolved significantly. This influenced planning for subsequent operations, particularly Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where similar defensive strategies were expected and encountered. Respect for enemy capability. The assumption that overwhelming American firepower would simply crush Japanese resistance proved wrong at Peleliu. Future operations were planned with more realistic assessments of Japanese capabilities and the costs of assault. Institutional learning. The Marine Corps studied Peleliu extensively, learning lessons about cave warfare, the importance of fresh troops, and the need for realistic casualty estimates. These lessons influenced training and tactics for the rest of the war and beyond. The Battle of Peleliu was fought with exceptional courage by Marines and soldiers who did everything asked of them. They assaulted heavily defended positions, fought in nightmarish terrain and brutal heat, and ultimately accomplished their mission of securing the island. The men who fought at Peleliu deserve honor and remembrance, but the battle itself was a strategic mistake, a costly, unnecessary operation that served no important purpose and could have been avoided. The island that was supposed to be secured in 4 days took 73 days to conquer. The operation that was supposed to support the Philippines invasion contributed nothing to it. The casualties that were supposed to be light exceeded 10,000 men. Peleliu stands as a cautionary tale about the importance of strategic flexibility, the dangers of institutional pride and inter-service rivalry, and the need for military operations to serve clear strategic purposes. It demonstrates that courage and tactical success are not enough if the strategy itself is flawed. The Marines and soldiers who fought at Peleliu accomplished everything they were asked to do. They took the island, destroyed the Japanese garrison, and maintained the honor of their services, but they should never have been asked to do it. The battle should have been cancelled when strategic conditions changed. The island should have been bypassed and left to wither. Instead, over 10,000 Americans were killed or wounded, and nearly 11,000 Japanese died, fighting for an island that mattered to no one and contributed nothing to ending the war. That is the tragedy of Peleliu. Not that the battle was lost, it was won tactically, but that it was fought at all. It was America's unnecessary battle, and the men who fought there paid the price for strategic misjudgment and bureaucratic inflexibility. The epitaph for Peleliu might be written in the words of Eugene Sledge, who fought there. The Japanese fought and died for Peleliu with the same fanaticism as the soldiers we had faced at Tarawa. But unlike Tarawa, which had strategic significance, Peleliu was strategically unimportant. Peleliu was the battle America didn't need to fight, but 10,000 American casualties later, the battle was won, the island was taken, and the war went on. The men who died there gave their lives for an objective that didn't matter. That is the lasting shame of Peleliu, not the conduct of the battle, but the decision to fight it.